Hello and welcome to the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo. Let me be the first to say good afternoon. Glad to have you here. My name's Eric Pfeiffer. I'm with Hoosier Ag today, and we are live today from Westfield's Grand Park. Of course, we're live if you're actually here watching us. We're live if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. We're not live if you're listening to the podcast much later, so sorry you missed the boat. But I've got Purdue Extension soybean specialist Shaun Casteel here, and Purdue Extension corn specialist Dan Quinn here. And I want to start off this podcast by apologizing. I really was trying to do something special for you folks, and I tried to get Dan and Shay, but all I could do was get Dan and Shaun. But I'm confident that Shaun can probably bust out a few lines of tequila, right? You could do that.
We can work on that little karaoke.
Okay.
All right.
Perfect. So we do the Purdue Crop Chat podcast at least once a month, sometimes twice if they have good things to say. And sometimes they do. I like working with these guys. They're pretty easy to work with. And I know that a lot of folks around the state work with them as well, giving them calls to see what's going on. Today, we're going to focus in on what's been going on this past season. There were some ups and downs, obviously. We'll let the guys kind of go through and break down what happened throughout the season. And then we would love to take your questions, especially if you've got questions that might be able to stump one of these guys. I would love that. That'd be fantastic. So let's start over here with Shaun.
Well, this is a shock. I get
Yeah.
to start first.
We're going to start with you.
Okay.
We're going to start with you. You are now the elder statesman now that Bob's not here.
Burn.
This is the new Bob Nielsen, by the way. Shaun says new and improved. If Bob's watching, hi. So Shaun, let's talk about soybeans this season. You have been dubbed first Debbie Downer, then Donnie Downer when I felt bad about calling you a girl's name. But either way, you haven't been very high on the soybean crop this year. And USDA finally kind of got in line in their last report,
Right.
lowering the expected yield. So just talk about this past season for soybeans and some of the issues that we faced.
Sure. I appreciate that. And again, you led into Debbie, Donnie, and then Shay even. So I mean, there's three names. I've got some identity issues here, so we're going to work through that. But in terms of this year, soybeans started off great. And we think about the year that we had. We had April that was dry. We had a lot of recreational tillage that was going on. We had a lot of planting that occurred early. And so the pace was excellent, right? And when we think about making good soybeans, we got to set the foundation, and foundation is timely planting. And so we had that. We had over half our crop planted before the first half of May, which is a nice spot for us to be. Typically the 20th of May, we've got about half our crop planted, and so we set the stage for that, and then had some pretty good up season growth. Ratings were excellent. We were really 65-70% good to excellent all season long, and that started from the get-go. And then what you give me a hard time about is that mid-June to mid-July, it was wet for a lot of people. I had a few other conversations today that they didn't have that rain, but they turned off dry. But a good portion of the state was this mid-June to mid-July highlighter green soybeans. They just had saturated wet feet. And so that was a major part of why I was down on the crop in terms of, how can we get a 65-70% good to excellent rating whenever we've just got these yellowing soybeans. And it's one thing to have a yellowing soybean, a V2, V3. That's normal, right? They're going through the awkward stage of life is what I call it, Dan. The idea that they're a teenager growing so fast, there's not enough nitrogen there. But whenever that highlighter green, into reproduction, so R1 flowering, and to even start pod development, that's a case where we're sold short. And so that's where I was worried about that crop. And we had that 4 weeks or so, and then it's turned off dry. And so those beans took longer to respond. And what I mean by that, they didn't get their good nitrogen content, the supply that was coming from the nodulation until into August. And then at that point, we didn't have much season left. All that to be said, we still yielded very well from August, September, October. The yield forecast had been 60 bushels at the state level, and we finally dropped down in November to 57 bushels. And that's one of the top yielding years still. 2020 had several of those conversations today in the past few days with our certified crop advisor conference that 21 beans were good, but not quite as good as 20. And I think that's for good reason, right? We didn't have good nitrogen supply. I think that we turned off dry a little bit in some of these areas. And so what few pods were there had a hard time filling. And so I think we have some smaller beans, but overall, 57 bushels is still not bad for the year.
Well, and so we talk about this that we were a little down on the crop throughout the year, but it's still one of the higher ones that we've had in history. What do you attribute that to? Is it genetics? Is it just our incredible farmers and their management? What is it that you attribute that to?
Right. I think that a lot of this comes into play of, managing what we have. So again, I'll back that. But then also again, in timely planted beans allows us to weather the storm. Again, pun is intended with that, right? The ability to, okay, have good root development, get through these wet conditions, and then start to have a longer reproductive window. In that, we can have the ability to overcome, even with a low pod load. I think the other part of it is, we did have a spot rain here and there. We got good sunshine that came into that August to September, and so you look at the tail end of the season, it didn't get cut off, right? We didn't get a fall freeze that really cut it short. So whenever we're trying to recover from these wet feet, or think about now it starts to dry out, we didn't get a cold snap to really drop it. If we get these night temperatures in late August, September that are 50 degrees for 3 nights in a row, that plant is really shutting down. And so we really didn't have that. So we were able to, utilize the full growing season that we had. And I think that had a big part of it.
Let's talk about corn now. Dan, by the way, when I was trying to come up with the joke to open this thing, I was trying to find a song that had soybeans in it, and there aren't very many.
That's all right.
So I think corn is more popular. So you might have to sing some Tim McGraw later, where the green grass grew, corn
That's
pop up
fine.
and rise.
That's
Okay,
fine.
we can do that.
Corn makes whiskey. What?
Yeah, there you go. So let's talk about this corn crop. All the farmers that I spoke with, I don't know, June, are like, this is the best I've ever seen. It's the best I've ever seen. And they were so high on this crop. And I think that lasted for much of the season. Did we end up where people expected that they might?
Yeah, I think the corn crop really for the entire year has been fantastic. It maybe tapered off a little bit towards the end of the season here. Looking at the most recent USDA crop report for the state, but we're still settling in at about 189 bushels per acre. So 189 bushels per acre is tied for state record yield average. So I don't know what that says, with me. Maybe that's setting the bar too high with me coming here.
You got to start lower. Your first year. I mean, so Bob's on the exit,
Yeah.
you're on the enter.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a lot
So,
to say there.
looking back at the corn season this year, I started at Purdue in May, and we had really good timely planting with corn, and it was fairly dry in the spring, and we kind of joked that us at Purdue we were preparing for a drought.
We solved that, right?
Yeah,
We actually had a kumbaya.
We had a webinar. We were preparing for drought, so we know how to solve future droughts in the future at Purdue. But we had timely planting, and then it was right when we were starting to get worried that it might get dry. We got plenty of rain across the state, and where I look at in this corn crop and why it was so good for so long really centered around that pollination period. So when corn was tasseling, so kind of that around the 4th of July into July. We just had adequate rainfall, adequate soil moisture. You look at the drought maps during that time in this across the state, we just didn't have much drought. And looking at ears when we got close to harvest, so we have trials across the entire state of Indiana, and we were pulling ears in every single one of those trials. And what we noticed is that every single ear was just full to the tip. We had just great pollination, great conditions during pollination, so excellent kernel set for that corn crop. And you look at our condition ratings throughout the entire year, they've hovered around, 72, 73%, good to excellent. And we just had, timely rainfall, good rainfall, hasn't gotten too hot on us in a lot of areas. We had good rainfall during pollination. Now, some of that yield is kind of tapered off as we are getting our final yield reports. And there's some farmers that in certain areas of the state are saying, maybe my yield just wasn't as good as I had hoped. But there's majority of the farmers I talk to say this is some of the best corn they've ever had. But why that is, when we get towards the end of the year, we had some issues come in with, it did get dry on us. So you look at the central part of the state, kind of where we're at right now, the Indianapolis area, down in the southeast portion of the state, it did get dry on us. So we thought we were going to have some of the best corn we've ever had in some of those areas, and it got dry and we lost some yield. And you think about tar spot too. So tar spot is a hot topic for a lot of farmers, especially in the northern part of the state. A lot of irrigated farmers really got hurt pretty bad with tar spot. So I think that was a big indicator of why some of those yields were lower than what we'd hoped.
Now, you mentioned tar spot. That's where I was going to go next here is it wreaked havoc in some areas. In some areas, though, it came in, but perhaps a little too late to have any yield impact. But do we run the risk now that it showed up to begin with? Do we run the risk of that showing up earlier next year and maybe having that yield impact?
Yeah, that's the difficulty with tar spot. And, working with our plant pathologist, Darcy Talenko, who is probably one of the top, if not the top, tar spot researchers around. The difficulty with tar spot is just figuring out when it's going to come in. And the other difficulty with tar spot, too, is that when you have it, you have it. It's different from something like southern rust, which shows up for guys in southern Indiana, where you kind of get a clean slate every year, and we're just worrying about whether or not that disease actually blows up into the state. Tar spot, it likes to hang around in that corn residue in those soils, and once you have it, you have it. So just getting back to the importance, you have to scout your crops. You can't just drive by 55 miles an hour and say, oh man, that corn looks good. You have to get out in these fields, scout these crops, listen to these pathologists who do everything they can to forecast the disease, telling you where it is. Darcy does a really good job of indicating where that disease is and what counties and what time, and just trying to find that disease. And when you find it, manage it accordingly to be on top of it.
Now, you say manage it accordingly. You've figured all that out too, right? Of how exactly to manage it, because that's the big question for next year. You mentioned not knowing when it's coming in.
Yeah.
That makes it tough to manage, and just knowing when to apply things. It's hard.
Yeah, it's difficult. We look at tar spot. I've heard it referred to. The tar spot is kind of the corn world's COVID. It's new, for a lot of folks. So there's still so much we have to learn. A lot of seed companies are doing a really good job of finding hybrids that are, not fully resistant, but maybe has some control aspect or moderately resistant to that disease that can really help. So I was telling folks towards the end of the year, if you have tar spot, scout some of those fields. Take a look at those hybrids that you have and see which ones are doing well and which ones aren't. And two, from a fungicide aspect, that's where it's so important to be on top of this disease. So scouting those fields when you find it and getting those sprays out in a timely manner. Two, you think about some of the issues folks had with just getting a plane on some of their fields. I've talked to some folks. They said, I need my fungicide now, and then 3 weeks later is when that plane can get there. So that's really when the importance of just walking those fields, listening to those pathologists, looking at these forecasts that they do, and just staying on top of that disease. Because if you don't, I've just seen, kind of horror stories with that disease that it can take over an entire field.
Speaking of horror stories, let's talk about 2022 and some of the input costs. It's really starting to hit people hard. The supply chain issues, logistics, transportation, all of these things. Hearing, we did the Purdue crop chat last month, and if you haven't taken a listen to it, you really should. It was with Bill Johnson, Purdue Extension weed specialist, and he's talking about the shortages in herbicide. And a lot of that, from what I'm hearing, is surrounding the packaging. We've got a shortage of packaging to actually get it out to people. So, let's kind of recount some of the things that we've talked about in the past couple of months. It was 2 months ago we talked about fertilizer and what was going on there with Jim Camberato from Purdue Extension. Just recount for us some of the things that he talked about with fertilizer being in short supply or at least being very expensive, what that might look like for farmers come 2022.
Yeah, I think you look at fertilizer, first, P and K, so phosphorus and potassium fertilizers are through the roof. You look at nitrogen fertilizer too, hearing reports of folks that it might be upwards of $1 a pound, so maybe double of what they paid in the past. So we really kind of highlighted, first with P and K, a lot of times those applications go on in the fall, and just prioritizing your fields. So getting out and soil sampling your fields. The way the universities built their recommendations in some of those maintenance ranges, they're kind of built to give folks the flexibility. So if I get out, soil test my fields and realize exactly what my range is, maybe I can get away with this year with not applying P and K. And certain, you look at the removal of the crops and even though you're in that maintenance range, your soil test values probably aren't going to go down that much in 1 year. So maybe you can get away with it this year. So getting out in those fields, getting them tested, and kind of prioritize some of those fields. Nitrogen fertilizer, that's a difficult one. Folks were worried whether or not they could even get some. But now we're hearing reports that maybe folks will be able to get it, but how much is it going to cost? And, we're trying to figure out and tell folks that maybe you need to be as efficient as possible in applying your nitrogen. And also, too, maybe you can get away with backing that nitrogen rate down, maybe 20 to 30 pounds, and fertilizing for maximum profit instead of fertilizing for maximum yield next year.
It's hard to farm without an arm and a leg, and that might be what you have to give up for fertilizer next year. What about herbicides? We talked with Bill Johnson. Again, just availability seems to be a big issue.
Yeah, so when we think about availability on the herbicide and cost, I think Bill was making the comment last month, nearly 6 times what it was a year ago for even just glyphosate. And so I think we have to look at that in terms of the price and putting that out there. If supply is an issue, and instead of having the ability to go out and do two applications with the glyphosate or glufosinate, we need to be able to pick and choose which timing is the best. And so to think about what you have with the weeds that are out there, I think more than ever, which sounds kind of crazy, but we've been saying more than ever on herbicides for years now with herbicide resistance. But now when we look at supplies, we need to make sure we've got residuals out there, so then that can take us through. So again, a field to start off clean with whatever herbicide technology you're able to use, have a residual so it provides you a window and a little bit longer control. And, if you think about maybe some of the cautions that people have had on residuals, that it costs more. Well, shoot fire, whenever we think about some of our just glyphosate, glufosinates that should be on the cheaper side, we're knocking the area of what a residual is going to be. So why not go ahead and jump into that? I think one of the big things that we learned and talked about with Bill was the fact that we might actually become better weed resistant managers. In other words, if we're going to have a field that's going to be maintained, we're going to be putting residuals out there and taking care of weeds that are resistant to glyphosate, that's resistant to some of these other chemistries, so that we can, produce a crop that's, not going to be succotash. It's not going to be a mixture of weeds and beans and corn for that matter.
We are live at the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo. We're live streaming on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. You might also just be listening to this in the traditional way on our podcast. We appreciate you joining us in whichever way you are listening. And we do have folks here in the crowd. Do any of you have any questions for Dan and Shaun? I was really hoping that we could get someone that could just absolutely stump these guys. It would really make my day. Does anyone have any questions for Dan and Shaun? We've got one back here. Shaun, I'm going to switch you here. Take this Hoosier Ag Today mic and make sure you're showing it there so everyone can see it. You got to rep the brand.
I get kickback on that, don't I?
We'll see.
Okay.
Negotiations ongoing. Here we go.
Okay, this is a soybean question. What can you spray and when on soybeans to control the height of the beans so they don't get too tall and large?
Okay, so the question is about controlling the height of soybeans and whether there's anything you can spray on them. So the big thing with managing for height on soybeans, I go back even before that, right, is to think about when are we planting, and then what seeding rate and what row spacing. So starting there is where I answer this kind of question, as well as the variety we select. Obviously there's going to be varieties that tend to have a little bit more rank growth, a little taller profile. So those are ones, if you've got a heavier soil or good fertility soil, that beans can kind of get out of hand, they can get lodgy on you. Let's select a variety that doesn't have quite as a rigorous growth pattern. Secondly, whenever we look at seeding rate, let's be on the lower side of that. Okay, so whenever we have higher seeding rates, let's say you're a 15-inch row planter and you're planting 150,000 seeds or something like that, and you have fields that are year in and year out are going to get this rank growth, we should be cutting those back to 120, 130 at least. And then if you've got fields that are maybe muck soils, I mean, I've been up down to 100, 120,000 seeding rate. That's going to give you the combination of you don't have the buddy system pushing those beans taller, getting rank and leggy and laying over. The other part of this is planting timely actually helps in terms of keeping a plant in a shorter stature. Okay, so in other words, we actually, I promote timely planting of soybeans, so late April, early May, and we're going to have those first few nodes that are stacked, right? They're going to be very close to each other versus a mid-May or later. Those internodes are going to be maybe an inch or two, and then that pushes the plant even taller. So the combination of variety selection, lower seeding rates, and an earlier planting date, that alone does a tremendous job in terms of controlling our height in soybeans. I mean, I'm 6'4", and I don't want soybeans up to my chest, right? I mean, it's kind of fun to do that. My kids love running through the maze of that, but I'd really rather have a bean that's compact, maybe up to my waist, 35, 36 inches tall or something like that. So that's on the front side of it. If there is anything that you want to do, there's people have talked about doing like a Cobra or a Lactofen, something like that, to burn your beans, or Flex Star, any of those. They can certainly burn the beans. They can certainly stunt the growth of those beans. I've done studies on that to look at, okay, stunning them and increasing our yield. 1 out of 6 times I was able to do that because we prevented the rank growth that you're talking about, but it's the rank growth that happened in August, right? And these applications were done at V4 and early on. The other years, when I did that type of application, I actually got a yield hit. Okay, so I really hesitate to do anything in a foliar spray to burn my beans, to keep them stunted. If they happen to get stunted, they can do decent, but I look toward variety selection, planting date, and seeding rate to really control that height.
Do we have any other questions from the crowd on hand here at the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo for Dan and Shaun? Anyone? Anyone? Well, gentlemen, I'll ask you this, and I haven't heard your response yet, so this could be a little scary. But we are here at the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo in a new location this year at Westfield's Grand Park. You've been to the show before. What do you think, Shaun?
What do I think? What do I get in return, right? No. No, I've been tickled to death. I've never been out here to Grand Park before, and just amazing facility in terms of what's available here in the building. Have all the equipment dealers here, the folks, conversations. I think it's been tremendous from what I've seen. I like the opportunity to come talk with you guys, and I think that you enjoy talking to the vendors, and I think it's been a great show.
Well, thank you for that. Dan, I know you haven't been to this one before because you're relatively new to us. 7 months being the new Bob Nielsen. What is your nickname, by the way? He was the King Corn. Have we come up with one for you yet?
No, I haven't heard one yet.
We've got to come up with something.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if I want to
Blister.
give that task to you all.
No, we're on the job.
That'd be Donnie and Shay. I don't think you want to give Eric that job.
We're on the job. But what do you think of the show?
No, I think it's great. I think this facility's great. There's just so many different equipment in here. Seems like a pretty good crowd this year. It was easy to get to for me. But coming to these shows, even for us, you think folks at Purdue, why is it even important for us to come to these shows? But it's important for us to even see what's out there and see what kind of equipment folks are interested in. Is there ways that we can maybe incorporate new technologies or different things we're seeing into our own research program? So it's really important for us to, I really enjoyed walking through a lot of these booths and getting to talk to folks and see what new technologies are out there.
Final call for questions for Dan and Shaun. If you come up to the stage after the show and you grab them and you stump them, I'm going to be a little upset because I wanted that on air, okay? But no, they are probably going to stick around here for a little while. Come grab them and chat with them. Oh, we've got a question here. We've got a question over here. Let's see what I can do here.
Okay, so this is a corn-related question. I was crop scouting in southern Indiana a lot this year, and we, like my fellow interns, noticed a lot of corn in southern Indiana, especially tasseling at like V15, 16 instead of like 17 or 18. Did you notice that at all either, or can you explain why and if that caused any yield damage at all?
Yeah, offhand, I don't think we noticed that specifically, but you think about corn and its development, it develops specifically on, growing degree days and heat units, a little bit different than soybeans. So you think about looking back actually in the temperatures in those specific areas, I think there's potentially we're maybe a little bit warmer, a little bit drier. So if you get a little bit warmer, you can actually have it tassel maybe at V15, V16 if it's a little bit cooler because it's not accumulating those heat units in time. Maybe have tasseled a lot later. Another aspect too that we've seen from a management perspective is that if you have starter fertilizers, so different starter fertilizers through planters, we actually see where the corn can actually tassel sooner with those starter fertilizers. So it gets kind of a jump start, tends to be somewhat of a growth stage ahead as it carries through that season with that fertilizer, and actually can tassel. We've had strips with starter, no starter, and actually tassels a lot earlier. But indications on yield and whether that should impact yield, I don't see much of an impact on why that would actually hurt the corn crop. It all depends on when it tassels. So if you had it tassel early and you're able to have a lot more better conditions when it tasseled compared to if it tasseled later and then it got hot and dry on you, it could harm your yield in that aspect. But just from the point of tasseling earlier, does it harm yield? Probably not.
So Dan, I've got a follow up on that. So if that starter is causing it to advance in growth and tassel earlier, is it necessarily having less leaf development or the same leaf development but just faster? Or am I looking to stump you and have Eric here? You can fire back.
I don't think it's less leaf development
Okay.
overall. I think it's just about a growth stage ahead, and then you
The
typically
time to go through the
Yeah,
growth
time
stage
to
is
go
much faster,
through.
right?
because you see that at the end of the season with harvest,
Right.
and that corn plant is progressing through that season a lot faster with starters. That we typically see about 1 to 2% less soil moisture or grain moisture
right.
with that starter fertilizer. So I think it's just that plant just progresses a lot quicker as it has those nutrients a lot more available. But off the top of my head, maybe that is a stumping question, something we haven't.
I would anticipate that it would probably be the same leaf
Yeah.
development, that we're not short on it. I would just think it'd be
I don't
advancing.
think the plants are shorter. They're not behind in leaf development. Just we typically see that tassels a lot sooner.
Yeah.
We have grain moisture a lot lower at harvest, so that plant just progresses a lot quicker through that season.
It just seems to be a nice tool too, right? Not always are you getting a yield advantage to a starter per se if you've got the same nitrogen program that's efficient, right? You and I have talked about what can we do with this upcoming year with high nitrogen prices, and so try to be efficient with it. So starter help through these kind of whatever planting conditions and a side dress, but then also you think about on the harvest window, if you are 1 or 2 grain percent lower, less fuel for drying and everything else. So some profitability could come into a starter, right? And to now go into your double on your corn, on your nitrogen price. So if you got a starter system, using it less on grain dry down. So profitability just kind of for me as a soybean guy, it just screams, okay, let's make sure we're using a starter as well as the risk effects or the potential from, nitrogen loss.
Yeah, I think when we look at the nitrogen prices that we're seeing and what we're trying to have folks understand is trying to be as efficient as possible applying that nitrogen fertilizer. And you think about a starter fertilizer application, specifically like a 2x2 starter fertilizer application, where maybe you can get 30, 40 pounds of nitrogen through the planter at planting. You're not putting all your nitrogen down at planting, so you're running the risk of having poor weather, or it gets too dry on us, too wet, where we lose a lot of that nitrogen. If you can have a little bit of nitrogen in that starter, carry that plant up until maybe V6, V7, that's when that peak uptake time is occurring from that corn plant. Then you can put the bulk amount of your nitrogen on and try to capitalize on that peak uptake so you're just not losing so much nitrogen. So being as efficient as possible as you can, try not to lose as much, and then get the most bang for your buck out of your nitrogen fertilizer application.
Yeah, so whether folks have the ability right now with the starter system, it seems like, okay, let's go ahead and do it. They're probably already doing it anyway. We are at an equipment show, so I mean, if starter is going to be bolted on or new fertilizer on a planter, it seems like if there's an investment there, that might be a little bit of a benefit when you've got high nitrogen prices, and think about timely harvest at the end of the season. Unless you're waiting on soybeans to get harvested like you did this year, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect too with nitrogen fertilizer and the prices the way they are, I'm both on my website and then Purdue. You look at Purdue resources that we have. We actually updated our nitrogen fertilizer recommendations, and we actually factored in the economic standpoint of nitrogen fertilizer application. So where's that point when that fertilizer, a pound of nitrogen, is not making you any more money
Right.
as that nitrogen is applied? So we're looking at, with nitrogen prices the way they are, so upwards of $1 a pound for nitrogen, that maybe you could actually cut back your nitrogen rate, maybe 20, 30 pounds, depending on where you're at in the state, and actually kind of fertilize for maximum profit more so than maximum yield next year.
and ability to do that, make that decision with a V6 side dress. So you've got all the cards on the table, what you've already potentially lost, what the fertilizer price is versus right now, what budgets you're trying to work together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, issues on the corn side, I know you brought up to me earlier, and while we have people here and listening, the seed, I'm curious of the seed issues with soybeans. There's a lot of delayed harvest. I talked to some folks earlier here, even here at the show, that said, man, we just had trouble getting our soybeans out this year with delayed harvest. Is there seed issues going on? Is there things that people should be aware of on that aspect?
That's one I want to be on the lookout for. I've mentioned it throughout the fall, and then having these winter conversations already. So yeah, I think we're going to have some issues with seed size. To be on the lookout again, depending on where it's sourced from, right? We think about some of the drought conditions and some of the Iowa production, and so we get some seed from Iowa, or we had some conditions during our own seed production. So I think we're going to have some smaller seeds. Some of the comments I've heard today, seed lots around the 3,200 seeds per pound. So we're starting to approach it's a little bit higher seed numbers per pound, so a little bit smaller seeds. So be on the lookout for that, especially on equipment. Some equipment can handle that, others can't. And so to be able to manage for it. The one I really want to get onto, I mean, we get germ scores year in, year out, no doubt, but I would love to kind of push a little bit more on our seed suppliers. Is, okay, what's our vigor ratings? Because I even if we've got a 95% germ lot soybean, I'm really curious about our vigor ratings. So those aren't on our tag per se all the time. And so go back and talk to the seed dealers. Hey, can I get a germ score, a cool germ score, as well as a vigor rating? I think those are two areas we really need to look into. And okay, again, we're talking about money. If we're planting timely, good seed treatments that help with some of our diseases. So those are the areas I really want to look at on our seed supply this coming year.
Is there, from a seeding rate aspect, if the germ scores are low, should folks kind of adjust their seeding rates for next year, or pay attention to that and how that may factor in?
Yeah, I mean, germ scores always should be going into our seeding rate recommendations, no doubt. A turnkey on a 15-inch planter, 140,000, give or take 10,000. But, we can even cut that lower if germs are good vigor. We can go the opposite, right? If we're now in the 85% germ lots, or we've got low vigor and we're planting those earlier, those should be a higher seeding rate. All that to be said, soybeans can withstand a wide range of population, and then if I got around 100,000 plants, I'm fine. So it's what factors get you there in terms of the tillage equipment or no-till setup. Is it the time of planting, the seed treatments? If we've got 75,000 plants, I'm usually not doing any replant. And so now I'll try and think about, okay, let's make some money on these higher input prices. I mean, if we got good seed treatments and planted timely, good germ, we can probably cut seeding rates 20, 30,000 and start to save a little bit of money and not take off any yield top end.
Any other questions from out here? Anyone? No, you've heard them go on long enough? Okay.
Next time, I would really want to stump you, Eric. We get asked the questions. We look to stump you next time.
I'm not the expert. I'm the one that knows how to ask the questions of the experts.
But you stayed at a Holiday Inn, so you should be able to answer these questions, right?
Let's wrap up here, guys, and let's just start with Dan. Some final thoughts on 2021 as we go into 2022. Some things that folks need to be concerned about, other than prices and fertilizer. Anything else?
Yeah, I think, wrapping up, my first year here in Indiana in this position, how well the corn did. We had research trials across the state, and we had some areas where that's the best yield we've ever seen. So we had a great year this year, and hopefully we can carry that into next year. I think the big things is just fertilizer, soil testing.
I said don't bring up fertilizer. They don't want to hear about it anymore.
Getting out and soil testing your fields. I'm going to keep talking about fertilizer because that's all I get asked.
He follows Bob's mold. He doesn't listen.
Yeah. So just being efficient as you can with your nitrogen and prioritizing fields. And again, hopefully we get some adequate snow cover this winter and recharge a lot of that soil moisture in these fields. But hopefully we can have kind of the good year we've had this year and into next year. And I think, I'm going to use this time right now, in my final thoughts, just to give a little bit of a shout out for the folks in Western Kentucky. I am a graduate of the University of Kentucky. I did research in Western Kentucky. There's a lot of great people out there, and some of our colleagues, so Chad Lee, Carrie Knott, and Kirsten Wise, those folks down at the University of Kentucky, they lost their entire research facility. Wow, gone. So labs, grad student work, greenhouses, a multi-million-dollar facility that was built a couple years ago that was completely gone. So just I ask folks to, keep those people in their thoughts, and, there's different aspects if you're willing to give. I know Kentucky Farm Bureau has ways to give, and there's just a lot of different, Red Cross, but there's a lot of good farmers down there that lost everything as well. So I always want to, put that out there and just keep thinking about those folks in Western Kentucky, because there's just a lot of good people down there.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing that, Dan. Shaun, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think what I like to do during the winter and what I really want to encourage folks to do is to think about what worked this season, what didn't work this season. I mean, I look at farmer as the first researcher, really. I mean, you're exploring, you're experimenting with anything and everything from how you plant a crop to, whether it's fertility, whether it's, okay, we're playing with sulfur, we're playing with some fungicides. Go back and learn from it, right? And then look forward, okay, how can I set up things to learn again? So then I can advance my field, advance my farm, and move forward. So whether that's cutting seeding rates or whether it's looking at combinations with, a nutrient practice up front and foliar feeding later, or for fertility or fungicide. So just learn to go back and learn, and then start to plan some homework assignments the coming year.
Yeah, I was gonna just adding on top of that. You look across this venue, and there's so much technology out there, and so many tools that folks have to map their fields and look at yield maps and monitors, and making sure this winter that you're going back and kind of pinpointing, okay, this is where I had issues, or this is a spot in this field that just wasn't as good. This yield just wasn't as good in this area in this field, and going back and understanding why. So learning and how we can kind of target those specific areas moving into next year, maybe get more out of those areas.
Basically, you need to be like my 3-year-old. Why? And you get the answer, why? Just keep going back and answering that question.
All right, well, that just about wraps up the Purdue Crop Chat podcast. If we can go ahead and get the lyrics on the screen for Shaun here, that'd be fantastic.
Sounds good.
Okay, maybe
Merry
not.
Christmas.
We're trying to keep listeners, Shaun.
Christmas song?
Silent Shaun. Shay?
Yes,
Silent Shay?
Great, yes. Thank you for coming out here to the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo. We do the Purdue Crop Chat podcast each month, at least once a month, and you can find it at HoosierAgToday.com. If you haven't tuned in before, urge you to do that. It's a great program. As hard of a time as I give these guys, they actually do know what they're talking about. So we like to get that information out there for you. It's really good stuff. So please check that out at HoosierAgToday.com. We appreciate everyone coming out today, and my thanks to Dan and Shaun. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate you coming to the seminar stage presented by Ag Direct, Farm Credit Mid-America, and Bain Welker Equipment.